Okay, you guys are good.
Good morning. This is Debbie Moore. I'm co-chair of the Las Cruces Economic Recovery Ad Hoc Board, and I will call the meeting to order for Thursday, July 30th. The first order of business would be, is there any conflict of interest? Seeing none, I will move to ask for a motion to accept today's agenda. Do I have a motion?
Move to accept today's agenda, Sharon Thomas.
Do I have a second?
George Miller, I second that.
Have a motion and a second. Francisco or Cynthia, would someone please call roll for a vote on this?
Yes, Madam Vice Chair. This is on the motion to accept the agenda as presented. Mr. Michael Harris,
Yes.
Mr. George Miller,
Yes.
Ms. Sharon Thomas,
Yes.
Ms. Brooke Montgomery, Ms. Veronica Archuleta,
Yes.
Mr. Ron Fitzherbert, Mr. Ron Fitzherbert is absent. Mr. Doug Cowan, Mr. Doug Cowan is absent. Ms. Susan Greenwald,
Yes.
Ms. Jolene Martinez, Ms. Jolene Martinez,
Yes.
thank you. Ms. Arlene Lopez,
Yes.
Madam Vice Chair,
Yes.
and Mr. Chairman is absent. Motion passes.
Thank you. Moving on to the next item of approval for the minutes of the meeting on July 23rd, 2020. I would entertain a motion to accept.
This is Michael Harris. I'll accept, or motion to accept.
Sharon
George
Thomas.
Miller, second.
I have a motion and a second on the minutes for July 23rd meeting. Francisco, would you please call the roll?
Sorry, I was muted. This is on the motion to accept the minutes that were presented. Mr. Michael Harris,
Yes.
Mr. George Miller,
Yes.
Ms. Sharon Thomas,
Yes.
Ms. Brooke Montgomery,
Yes.
Ms. Veronica Archuleta,
Yes.
Mr. Ron Fitzherbert is absent. Mr. Doug Cowan is absent. Ms. Susan Greenwald,
Yes.
Ms. Jolene Martinez,
Yes.
Ms. Arlene Lopez,
Yes.
Madam Vice Chair,
Yes.
and Mr. Chair is absent. Motion passes.
Thank you very much. With that, we're going to move into item number 5, which is the discussion and presentations. We have 2 today. The first being the topic that we've talked about is the Inclusive Economic Recovery Framework. And Francisco, did you want to say anything prior to me introducing our guest speaker?
Yes, Madam Chair. Thank you very much.
You can introduce him. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Joe Parilla is his fellow with the Brookings Institute, and they have been working on this inclusive economic framework. And Mr. Miller was actually kind enough to provide a contact phone number for Mr. Parilla. So we have reached out to him, and he has very kindly agreed to speak on behalf of the work that the Brookings Institute has carried with regards to an inclusive economic recovery framework. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Mr. Parilla, and you can share your screen, Joe. Just as there's a green button right there in the bottom portion.
So I'm getting a message that says host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okie dokie.
So I think I need permission.
Dominic, would you be able to make him a host really quick so he can share?
I'm sorry, for who?
For Mr. Parela, Joe Parela.
Yes, one moment.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks. So I'll try that again in a second once the permissions are there. But Francisco, thanks for the introduction, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here on behalf of Brookings, where our program is one of 5 at Brookings. For those who are not familiar, we're a public policy research organization based in Washington, D.C., but our program, our audiences are exactly the people who are on this Zoom call. So we work on research that looks at the economic and social conditions in cities and regions and states, and our audiences are the cross-sector groups of leaders, government for sure, but also nonprofit sector and the business sector, as well as higher education, who influence the trajectories of their communities. And no more important is this group, the groups like it across the country, than in a moment of crisis. And so over the last matter of months, our entire program has focused its research agenda on COVID and specifically on the economic recovery that needs to occur in its wake. And so I will walk through the kind of broad strokes of that framework, and then give you all some examples of what other communities are doing across the country that support that framework. And then the hope, I think, is that this just instigates some reactions or questions, and we can have a discussion following the presentation. But the context, of course, in every community is this 2-front battle. So in the main, COVID is a public health crisis, and the safety and security of the American people is the most important outcome. And of course, the county and the region have not gone unimpacted by the virus, and as a result, as other governments have done, you've taken measures to essentially shut the economy down, which we saw during the spring resulted in widespread business liquidity challenges. So the middle graphic shows that about 3 in 4 small businesses in Las Cruces received loans through the Paycheck Protection Program, which was the federal government's attempt to sustain the small business sector as they dealt with these liquidity challenges and the fact that they had to close down many of them. Even with those measures, and the idea of PPP was to try to keep small businesses in business while also retaining their employees. But of course, there has been these historic negative downturn in the labor market, and the unemployment rate has ramped up pretty drastically in Las Cruces as it has in other communities. So these are the near-term, very real challenges that everyone is aware of. But what COVID revealed was that we had a pretty insecure economy to begin with, and there was really 2 long-running trends that I wanted to highlight that COVID basically landed on top of. The first was that larger, predominantly coastal metropolitan areas, the Bay Area, Seattle, Boston, San Diego, those 5 metropolitan areas alone accounted for 90% of the growth in innovation economy jobs between 2005 and 2017. So this is an illustrative stat of how a combination of technological and corporate wealth has concentrated in the hands of relatively few cities, and then relatively kind of few people within those cities, which is exemplified by the second set of statistics, which shows that as the country was sorting itself geographically, and kind of these really high-paying jobs were concentrating more in these larger cities, we had a broader challenge around job quality, such that by my colleague Martha Ross's analysis, she estimates that about 44% of the US workforce, including 54% of African-American workers and 63% of Latino or Hispanic workers, essentially earned less than a family sustaining wage even before the crisis. So you had a lot of economic insecurity that was built in. Even though we had a relatively strong labor market by certain measures, there were these economic insecurities that were built into that then COVID has obviously pushed many of these families into crisis. So as I had said, our work at Brookings is both around documenting these economic conditions, but then also providing policy and programmatic solutions. And so on Thursday of last week, we launched this COVID-19 Metro Recovery Watch website, which really tries to provide a framework for recovery. It tries to spotlight local efforts, and then it also provides an index that allows local communities to see what's happening over time. Unfortunately, we limit that to metropolitan areas that have at least 250,000 residents. So as of now, we're thinking about how to expand this tool, but as of now, Las Cruces not included in that Metro Recovery, just in case you go look for it. Ultimately, the economic recovery framework looks at three key principles. So the first principle is for local communities, these can be cities, these can be counties, regions, even states, is to set goals and objectives for their recovery. This is kind of basic strategy, and we think that should be a two-part goal. One is that the local economy should be kind of increasing prosperity in the wake of COVID, so you're bouncing back and rebuilding better than you were before. That would be measured by things like kind of average incomes, the quality of jobs that people are achieving. We think there needs to be a very explicit second part of the goal that is taking into account those statistics that I showed earlier about the fact that there are still lingering racial inequities within the country, and we think that promoting racial justice and racial inclusion is a really important second goal. And so the idea here is to take those broader outcomes and think about, like, what are the goals and metrics that this community wants to choose. And this is an example from the San Diego Economic Development Corporation, which has been a partner of ours, that essentially try to create three goals that they think leads to a more prosperous and inclusive economy related to skilled workers, related to quality jobs in small businesses and startups, and related to the number of thriving households, which means households that can make ends meet given their earnings and the cost of living. Another example that we like to cite is from Kansas City. So this is Kansas City Rising, which is a civic initiative that is a partnership of the Chamber of Commerce and the Economic Development Corporation in Kansas City, as well as a CEO group. Again, the mechanism is going to look slightly different depending on the community, but the idea is to take a series of metrics related to kind of broader systematic outcomes and hold local institutions to account to try to meet those metrics. And in Kansas City, what they have a good framework in that they have system metrics. So they're looking at things like, education, things like the number of quality jobs being created, the number of startups, but then they also have strategy metrics. So they have like a portfolio of strategies in each of these areas that then have their own individual performance indicators. So this is just about like taking the mantle to create some broader recovery metrics. Our sense is to meet this broader type of recovery metrics framework, you have to actually adopt a strategic framework that is typically a little bit more broad than traditional economic development efforts. We think that three areas are particularly important, and this is a framework that has been advanced in Northeast Ohio, so a collection of cities and metropolitan areas in and around Cleveland and Akron and Youngstown and Canton. And it's pretty straightforward. The idea is that you need to promote local business and industry growth to create good jobs. you need to upskill or reskill or continue to train and educate a racially diverse talent base to fill those jobs. And that you need to ensure that there aren't neighborhood level or community level barriers that are preventing people from accessing opportunities. So this is a creation, preparation, access framework. This is essentially the recovery framework we've adopted as in our products. If you go to the website, you'll see a bunch of ideas that are grouped basically under these 3 themes. And that is really about kind of giving people a way to talk about their work, both locally and to state policymakers, to say, okay, we have a comprehensive strategy that is worthy of investment from a broad range of government and perhaps philanthropic and private sector stakeholders. And it kind of communicates to the public, here are the things that we care about and here are the things that we're trying to get done. And so what should those things be, right? The remainder of the presentation, I'm just gonna highlight 3, what we call 3 actionable ideas in these areas. The first is really around the small business challenge. And we highlighted in the recovery series a case study from Detroit, which has a significant concentration of Black-owned businesses within the central city that traditionally had not been well served by mainstream financial institutions. They had struggled to get access to capital. They were subject at times to kind of bias by financial institutions. So when COVID hit, they were in many respects last in line to benefit from the federal policy solutions to support small businesses. And so what a group of philanthropic organizations and then neighborhood level business support organizations did was immediately deploy about $5 million in funding to support these small businesses through access to rent relief, through access to lending, through access to grants in some cases, as well as access to technical assistance. So that was really meant to stem the bleeding. The recovery strategy is longer term and more robust. And key elements include opportunities for small business owners to access technical assistance from these intermediaries. So these are like entrepreneurship support organizations or like business schools within universities or other folks, even mentor to mentor small business owners helping each other. They're providing access to PPE kits. So at last count is about 3,400 PPE kits were distributed to help small businesses open safely. And over 4,000 requests related to questions that small business owners had been fielded by this coalition, which calls itself Detroit Means Business. Ultimately, this is probably going to be a $10 million strategy, but if you kind of calibrate that to Cruces, you're with Detroit is about 7 times as big as Las Cruces. So you're looking at between $1 and $2 million. That would be a reasonable response to the small business challenge if you wanted to pursue a similar strategy. So the second major challenge is around these really, really high unemployment rates. And for that, one interesting idea has been put forward in Birmingham, Alabama. Really, it's a coalition that calls itself Birmingham Strong, which was led by the city of Birmingham, but supported by corporations and the Community Foundation, among others. And really what Birmingham Strong spun out was a program called the Birmingham Service Corps. So this is an idea similar to the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression, that there are these civic and public needs that become more acute during a crisis like COVID. And we have actually a group of people who are unemployed that could be brought to bear through activities with civic and public purpose. And so that's essentially what this strategy tries to do. And it's worked with about 300 folks. These are all age 18 or older. They're people who have lost their job. They get paid between $15 and $25 an hour to do things like drive public housing residents to testing locations. They get checks. They do that safely, of course. They're informing the deployment of mobile testing and providing patient referrals. They prepared and distributed lunches for 12,000 public school students. They've set up different kind of sites where people can go and ask questions about where they can receive public benefits or get access to charitable resources. This to us is a model of something that we would love to see, for instance, the presidential campaigns take on, this idea of a national service corps that could support local communities. But what we like about what Birmingham has done is they've essentially put in place the local infrastructure to execute a service corps. Their budget is about 1.5 million, which is serving the city of Birmingham, which is about 225,000 people, just to give you a sense of the cost and the size of the community, which is roughly in line with Las Cruces. The final idea is acknowledging that there are these long-standing gaps across neighborhoods in our cities. So every city, no matter how prosperous, has pockets of poverty and kind of economic distress. And those policies were like the result of that was in many cases the result of intentional public policies that had built up over a century that segregated people by income and by race. And our notion is that without addressing the underlying challenges of those place-based disparities, it will be hard to have an inclusive recovery. And so this idea that was put forward by a couple of colleagues of mine is essentially to advocate to states, so this would be something that would be advocated to folks in Santa Fe, to set up funds that would basically provide resources to locally owned new kind of investment structures. So this idea is a little bit wonky for those who aren't as familiar with financing, but the gist is this: like, you could create at a state level, say a $25 million fund that in turn could help local residents. So these are folks who live in the neighborhoods, who kind of know what they want in their neighborhoods. They could create these communal real estate ownership opportunities so that local citizens, so neighborhood level citizens, can use these funds to actually purchase real estate within their communities. And then they can kind of dictate how that real estate is used to meet local needs. And because they have an ownership stake, as that real estate appreciates or as the neighborhood changes, which is happening in a lot of cities, you're seeing these neighborhoods change, especially in central cities, that local residents would benefit from that. And so this is one where I don't think, Las Cruces would have necessarily the resources itself to stand up this fund, but this would be something that would make sense to advocate to state policymakers who are trying to think about how to use their recovery dollars to support recovery within local communities, and do so in a way that particularly is centering issues of racial inclusion in the recovery strategy. This is being done in places like Portland through an organization called Mercy Corps. They have what they call a community investment trust that is doing exactly this type of work. So those are three ideas just to get the conversation started. The final point I want to make is just the way in which this work gets delivered. So if first you kind of set your objectives, second, you pursue a portfolio of actionable ideas that you think are going to get to those objectives. Our sense is that we need new types of institutional community capacity in our local communities to deliver on these solutions. And so this is an example from Minneapolis, where obviously the murder of George Floyd has made that city a kind of national bellwether for some of these issues around policing and racial justice. But even before that, they had launched an organization called the Center for Economic Inclusion, which is really led by the Black community in Minneapolis. But it has established support among local governments, funder collaboratives, regional economic development organizations, CEO groups, and importantly, in a place like Minneapolis, kind of large corporate leaders, leaders of large corporations. And I think this will look different in every community. The idea, and I don't mean to necessarily suggest that every place is going to have the type of corporate leadership that Minneapolis has, just because they have a lot of Fortune 500s. But the principle is that exactly as you all are doing, bringing together leaders from across government, the private sector, philanthropy, and nonprofits, the community grassroots groups is just really, really important for this work to have credibility among as broad a set of community members as possible, because it is very hard work. It is complicated work, I'm sure, as you all know, and having the buy-in in an era of very limited resources, having the buy-in of as many stakeholders as possible becomes really, really important in terms of actually executing these types of strategies and financing them. So I will stop there. You can get more if you just Google, COVID-19 Metro Recovery Watch. You can go get all 9 ideas. There's a whole bunch of other local recovery solutions that we profile in case studies. And so I didn't get into all that here just because of lack of time, but it is there online, and it's exactly for audiences such as this one. So I hope you check it out. So I'll stop there, and I'd love to just kind of take questions, reactions from folks.
Thank you for that awesome presentation, and I really do appreciate you meeting with us today. Sorry I'm late too, by the way. I'm Chris. I am the chair of the Las Cruces Economic Recovery Board. So with that being said, if any of our members of our board have any questions, comments, anything like that, please do raise your hand at this time, and we'll get you going. Okay, Mr. Harris.
Yeah, thanks for that presentation. It was really great. These are things that I've been thinking also, and I'm sure other people on the board. I guess a question I had, if you have information about how effective any of these particular ideas are, and in particular, I was wondering, so in the first part of the presentation where you were talking about strengthening small businesses, providing financial, technical, and safety resources, can you give us an idea of maybe what the relative importance of the different resources that were provided were to the businesses? Like, if we're trying to go after low-hanging fruit or just the most impactful things, would you say that providing rent relief is more important than providing PPE? Probably in the early days, I could see PPE distribution being important. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so obviously it's the one caveat to my response is just going to be I'm not as familiar as you all are about just the nature of the public health situation in Las Cruces. I think there is still, at least in the communities where we're working more intensively, like say Alabama, like that is still very much a binding constraint to the economy because, and PPE specifically. So the idea that like for these businesses to open up safely, they need to invest essentially in these one-time or in some cases ongoing purchases of equipment, and they may not have the money to do that. And it's a very clear example of where the government should probably be stepping in, or some sort of civically oriented resources, because it's none of these businesses' fault that COVID hit, and yet so and they're only responding to public much needed public regulations about how to keep the population safe. Yet while the government is providing those regulations, it makes sense for them to also provide resources to allow those businesses to meet those regulations safely. And to the extent that we're going to have any sort of limited economic activity at these small businesses going forward, it's only going to be if people are safe going into them. So I'd still say that's a pretty important aspect. I think the second one where we've heard from local stakeholders as being lacking is what I would call like practical or technical assistance. So these are everything from like, I want to go get a PPP loan, but I'm not sure if it's for me. Can someone help me understand what the requirements are, what the process is? For businesses that had commercial banking relationships, that was taken care of by their bank, or maybe they had a lawyer. But for a 5-person small business, you know, like they don't necessarily have those relationships. So these, you know, economic development organizations or chambers of commerce have stepped in to provide that guidance, and it actually helped connect more people to those resources. The challenge going forward with that federal program is that for the loan to be forgiven, so for the loan to become a grant, you have to like prove that you kept people on your payroll, which is a more complicated undertaking than getting the loan to begin with. So there was like this initial wave of technical assistance to help people get a PPP loan. And now there has to be this second wave of technical assistance to help people get the loan forgiven, because otherwise it'll just saddle them with debt. And so I mean, I know there are some small business owners, I think, on this group, so I'd be curious to get their perspective too. But it seems to me that that type of community level technical assistance just around accessing financing is important. And then there's the more robust type of technical assistance, like, hey, I want to create a website, or I need to adapt my business model so that I'm going from dine in to, you know, only takeout, or I need a better digital marketing presence if I'm going to make it. Like that type of stuff is also important. It's not as important as like the first stuff, but if we're actually going to help small businesses adapt to the, you know, quote unquote new normal where more is done online, like those also become important aspects. And so like, I think the Detroit example is trying to do all of that. But the reason we highlight it is it's a particularly comprehensive effort, right? Like they're trying to do it all at once. I think, you know, other communities, like different institutions, are doing different elements of that, and they're trying to coordinate as best as they can, but it's by nature more fragmented. I hope that helps answer your question.
Yeah, that helps. How much have you seen businesses actually, so there's, you know, federal resources, how much have you seen people actually be like, hey, you know, if the city just, you know, stopped evictions or something, or provided more direct financial assistance, do you think, have you seen that there's a demand for that, or it's mostly just, I need to know how to access financing options that are already there, and if I do, then, you know, we're good? Yeah,
I think the moratorium on evictions was something that a lot of cities did, and it's still ongoing. Like in DC, they basically are extending that out until they stop declaring a public health emergency, which could be a long time. So I do think that that's a pretty fundamental part of the strategy. The challenge with eviction moratoriums is you're simply passing along the costs to the landlord, right? And in this case, like, you know, they're part of the economy too. But I do think that a lot of cities did that. I think there were some locally provided funding sources like grants or very low interest loans that were let either cities put forward, or now you're seeing states use recovery dollars to do like grants to small businesses. And that worked in the near term. It's just no community has the resources to do that at the scale that is required. So really only the federal government, either acting through the states or just new stimulus is going to be able to handle that at scale. So I guess to answer your question, there's some near-term stuff that, you know, local communities are doing and will continue to do, but it becomes really important to advocate to state leaders about how they use the dollars that they have in hand from the federal government, and then up until folks in Washington as they design the next round of stimulus to ensure that small business support is included.
Okay, yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, wonderful. And then just 2 clarification points, guys. if you could state your name for the minutes when you do ask a question or announce yourself. And then also, can I get co-hosting abilities to deal with the hand raising as well? Thank you. And then Ms. Martinez, you have your hand raised. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
Hi, Jolene Martinez, for the record. Thank you for the presentation. I had just two questions. One was, how would the city engage with your organization in developing a plan like you presented, maybe 3 actionable items where they could address the economic recovery of both citizens that live in that gap that you identified, the racial equity gap, and then also address small businesses, and then also address future recovery. So how would they engage in that relationship with your organization was the first question. And then the second question would be, what kind of training and technical assistance do you provide to like the city council or the city staff that helps them decide if this partnership with your organization is one that would benefit them, and then how quickly do those kind of things, can those kind of things be turned around?
So while we do more intensive partnerships with cities, but they're few and far between because they're very intensive and we are not a huge organization. So to your first question is, how do we work together? I mean, if we wanted to work together on a more intensive basis than how we're doing right now, or, then that would require kind of scoping that out from a resource perspective and a timing perspective. And I would be transparent, just given that we're already kind of underwater as a program, it would be hard for us to take on a new intensive partnership right now. And I guess that kind of answers your second question. So I wouldn't necessarily call us technical assistance providers, like we are co-collaborators in many ways. But I guess, my recommendation would be, we could think about if there are particular ideas that you all find compelling. What we would do is probably link you with the folks who are leading those strategies in other communities. So we wouldn't necessarily be the best people to tell you about how to implement something. It would be them. And we'd be happy to broker those introductions if there were particular things that you wanted to learn more about. So I'd say it'd be more in those informal ways, just given the resource constraints that we have, both time and money.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for that. Okay, so I do have a question actually. So under the Community Investment Trust, that actually sparks a lot of interest. So I sit on the board for the Community Foundation of Southern New Mexico. And in our strategic plan, we have had a lot of different conversations on what, doing something like this. So I would love if you could go back to that slideshow under the state community investment funds. And if you could just give me any more information on this, I really would like that, because we called it community impact investing is what we kind of referred to it as, but it kind of sounds like the same kind of thing here. And I was just hoping you could maybe elaborate on this a little bit with the key components, maybe if you could just go over those again.
Yeah. So these are this is the brainchild of a couple colleagues, so I'll try to do it justice. And I'll send you the link to the full brief as well, just through the chat. But the idea is really about taking, say, a pool of money that the state could put forward, or you could have a community foundation model that did this too. Doesn't necessarily matter where the funds come from. And they would be the gap filler in, to use the technical term, in the capital stack for kind of specific new projects to move forward. So say you want to build a community center, and that is the most important thing, or you want to build new housing or new commercial, you want to support a commercial corridor in a key neighborhood. Private sector financing may cover that, but most of the times it doesn't. So you need things that fill the capital stack. And so the idea of this fund is essentially a subsidy to those other investors. And it would be, the idea would be that because there would be a perceived risk by those investors that would be different than the normal investment, that this would incentivize them to put their money in. And then the idea was that those investors would get paid back first before the folks who support the state fund, right? So the government is kind of providing first in, last out money. And the idea there is that a bunch of activities that we think are really important for community wealth enhancement purposes, but that the market, for whatever reason, doesn't want to fund on its own, would have a greater likelihood of occurring. Now, where this doubly changes is who gets ownership, right? Like those deals do happen, like community development finance is basically, is that, but residents don't often like invest in those directly. So the double bottom line is not only you're improving the community, but you're allowing residents to take these very small shares, just like you would buy a share of stock in the stock market. You'd be able to buy into that real estate investment trust. And then as the gains accrued, they would accrue to the residents. So you're actually building community wealth while improving the neighborhood, which is, that's the innovation. There's a lot of effort that's been done to improve neighborhoods through new investment vehicles, but rarely have they tried to be designed in a way that the residents directly also benefit monetarily from the improvements in the neighborhood, if that makes sense.
Awesome. That's actually a really cool idea. Awesome. That was my question of the day. Did anyone else have a question or any comments or anything like that right now? Mr. Miller.
Hi, Mr. Perea. I'm George Miller for the record. Thank you for your presentation. Even though Las Cruces may not be the size that you have a direct partnership with Brookings Institute, are you not promoting, or are there not other like city groups across the country that are working together and sharing information? Can you talk about that a little bit, if you're still doing that or not? I know at one time there were some of the cities that you were working with started forming coalitions or groups together and trying to help each other. And that could be something maybe we could leverage. I don't know.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think there's, so first I'll take kind of how Brookings works with cities, and then I'll talk about some of the other nationwide intermediaries that would also be providing similar guidance. So Brookings, at one level, we do research and we share that out and everybody has access to it. At a second level, we are kind of soliciting through things like webinars or other like network, what we call network activities, the exchange of ideas between cities. And those are usually done through small cohorts because it's more intensive. So say 8 cities will get together. The third way that Brookings works with cities is more in this manner, where we'll do kind of demand-driven briefings, and then just through the networks that we have with other cities, like this is my answer to, I think, Jolene's question, which is like, we're happy to put you in contact with other people that are doing work that you may be interested in. But we're not, obviously not the only organization doing this. So the National League of Cities is the biggest organization that would be doing this work. They have an entire portfolio of COVID response activities. The U.S. Conference of Mayors, which is the mayoral association, so the mayor of Las Cruces may engage with the U.S. Conference of Mayors. The National Association of County Governments is another one, to the extent that the county plays a really important role here. And then you have other like networks like the Association of Chambers of Commerce, like I don't know if Debbie is engaged with them. So like, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of information out there and a lot of opportunities to join webinars and learn about different parts of this issue. So I think it's a great point to say that there are some ways that Brookings may be uniquely positioned to help, acknowledging our own capacity constraints. And if we aren't the right fit, there's National League of Cities and other organizations.
Great. Thank you. Follow-up question, if I may, Mr. Chairman. When we talk about inclusive economic development, when you're saying the word inclusive, some of the three pieces you mentioned touched a little bit on that, but the structure of the city or the people you get involved, can you talk a little bit about how to get that inclusive voice throughout the whole system to make it really, we could do 3 programs that kind of help some workers, but is it not true that unless we can embed that in the whole structure, then it's not really going to go to the full effect? If you could speak to that a little bit, that would be helpful.
I think that it's a fantastic question, and what I'm realizing this slide, it includes a lot of regional intermediaries, but what's important about the Center for Economic Inclusion, their work, is they've also engaged with entities like the Northside Funders Group, which is a funder collaborative that supports North Minneapolis, which is the kind of traditionally African-American community in Minneapolis, and where a lot of the challenges around racial inequity manifest themselves. And so that has been the novel contribution of an organization like this, is they straddle credibility with what you could call kind of elites, so governing elites or corporate elites or philanthropic elites, and grassroots community groups. And it's through those grassroots community groups, like whether that's nonprofits or churches or other community-based organizations, they have direct access to residents and what residents want. I think the challenge when people are in crisis is asking them to also commit civically, right? It's kind of hard when somebody's barely keeping their head above water for them to kind of come out and do a listening session or a brainstorming session. And so I always find a lot of tension in that, where you absolutely do not want to have top-down solutions that don't actually have people's lived experience in mind. And yet you don't want to put the onus and the responsibility on the already overburdened to come up with the answer. And I think the sweet spot is working with the groups who are kind of closest to those residents, and then using their capacity to lift up the voices without kind of directly asking people who are in a historic point of crisis and are probably struggling on a whole bunch of levels to come out and kind of comment on what the right strategy could be. I mean, this is my own personal view on this stuff. I mean, obviously there's been long debates about how to do community engagement and how to set policy. I just think, I always find that there's this tension where you need it for this to work and for it to be credible. You need that community voice, and yet it's during times of crisis that it may be hardest to usher it, because people are dealing with a lot.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, can I ask one final question? I don't know if anybody else has their hand up, but do you, from what you've seen with the research you've looked at for Las Cruces and some of the things you've seen around the country, do you have any specific recommendations for way forward for the city of our size, and with the maybe some of the unique situations that we find ourselves in? Or is that, it's kind of putting you on the spot, but if you have anything like that, might be helpful.
Yeah, I absolutely understand the question, and it's a good one. I think at one level, it's a little irresponsible for me to kind of comment on that, because I don't know Las Cruces well enough, I think, to get beyond the generic principles that I've offered. I will say that, like, what I've proposed here is both harder and easier in a smaller community. It's easier in that you can kind of wrap your arms around the different stakeholders and you can get people together. So it's at a size where you can get some things done, and people know each other, hopefully. The challenge also with scale is that, you may not have as many resources as a larger community, and you can't go to the Fortune 500 company and say, hey, can you cut a check? Which even a place like Birmingham can go do, where they have a big bank and a power company and things like that that are kind of vested. So I guess I say that my one kind of point would be, to consider less about what are the direct ideas. I don't think I'm prepared to comment on that, but like who within the critical institutions in Las Cruces isn't a part of the recovery conversation right now. And even if they can't, even if they're like, hey, we're not going to give you $1 million, to go launch your own thing, to figure out how they could plug in with other types of resources. So for instance, like if there is I know you have a university, and I don't know if you have a business school, but if you had a business school who had students who were interested in accounting, marketing, finance, like whatever, like, and would want to partner to help small businesses on some of these business model challenges, and you had, business professors that also thought that that would be valuable for kind of practical experience reasons for their research agenda and for their students. I mean, that's a model that Indianapolis has been pursuing. And it just makes I say it because there may be ways that your anchor institutions, if they're not already engaged, could plug in, not by cutting a check, but through kind of shared interest and also probably civic commitment. And I know that probably isn't exactly what you wanted, but I can't, to give more detail, I'd really have to know more about what's going on.
Understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Next we have Miss Debbie Moore's hand is raised. Go ahead, Miss Debbie.
I think, Mr. Chair, Sharon Thomas may have had her hand raised before mine.
Okay, wonderful. Miss Sharon Thomas.
Okay, let me unmute. I just want to say we do have organizations in this community who have access to residents, the Empowerment Congress and the Community Action Agency. And so in the past, we've had good luck with those agencies helping us get information to the community members. And also currently there's a discussion going on about New Mexico developing a public bank. And I think there's going to be legislation come to the legislature in 2021. And so in that case, the state puts its funds into a state bank rather than someplace on Wall Street. And that state bank then helps local businesses and projects, so you can invest in smaller, more local kinds of work. It might be useful to have the public bank people give a presentation to this group, because they're working on their legislation right now. So that's just a couple of suggestions.
Thank you for that, Miss Sharon. Miss Debbie Moore, go ahead.
Mr. Chair, I just want to, this is a great presentation. Thank you, Joe. As always, Brookings does wonderful work. I'm just a little concerned. I want to bring us back to our roles. I hear a lot of long-term things here. I hear a lot of collaborations and a lot of pieces to this. And I'm just trying to put my arms around what is the actionable item we can move forward potentially to the city council for approval. Is there pieces of that? Is it establishment of the Center for Economic Inclusion with all our partners? Is it to go with the community trust? I'm just trying to figure out what could be done in the short term and then in the long term, because our directives from the city council as they appointed this board was to cover the recovery period. And I hear some things that it's actually going to be long-term relationships. And I'm very familiar with Birmingham Strong, and I've done some research on Birmingham Strong, so I'm very familiar with pieces of this. And I think in our community, Mr. Chair, I think we've got several pieces of this, but I just want us to try to think, and maybe Jolene can kind of help. I want an actionable item that is very sort of short term, and then we can move to the long-term recommendation, maybe offline, maybe the city would be a partnership. I just want us to keep focused on what our ultimate responsibility is and directives from the city council. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So just to help filter based on Debbie's comment, so there was 9 ideas that we put forward that we all called actionable, but they're actionable over somewhat different timelines. I would say in terms of the 3 ideas that I presented today, the small business and worker kind of retraining, the service corps, those are much more near-term achievable activities. Putting together a state level kind of investment fund or a public bank or something like that is obviously something that can help spur recovery if you're thinking about a 24 to 48 month time period, which is probably what it's going to take for our economy to recover. But I just appreciate, Debbie, that you're saying, look, like our job is to come back with a couple of like immediately actionable. And so I would just let people know that the first two ideas presented, I would say, are more immediately actionable.
So, Mr. Chair, can I have a follow-up, please? Debbie Moore, Greater Las Cruces Chamber. I forgot to identify myself. I think the advantage that we have in our community, Joe, I think it's important, is we've got many of the workforce things already in place. So I think sort of your second and third actionable items is what I think can be some of the short term, how we go about that. But I think the long term of this would be a great recommendation. But I think we've got the workforce and some pieces of that in place with our workforce collaborative. But I also think there's some pieces missing here. And so, Mr. Chair, I just want to reiterate again, we just need to keep focused on what's short term versus long term. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For that. Next up, I have Brooke Montgomery. Ms. Montgomery.
Thank you, Brooke Montgomery, for the record. Something that just, when Joe was speaking, it made me think about something we have at NMSU. The MBA program has students who are in one of their, it's kind of like a capstone class in the engineering department. They form teams and they reach out to businesses in the community, and those teams solve real world business problems. It's something that I don't think is marketed very well, but it might be an actionable item to reach out to them and see what their classes are like next semester and connect them to businesses to solve problems that they're having right now. And just a thought.
Actually, Salud was a part of that program the last 2 semesters. We were the case study, and they did a lot of work with that, even on the HR team. So that's actually a really good idea that we can look into to get them involved in some way, shape, or form. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Cool. Okay.
With that being said, is there any other comments, questions, or concerns? We are at 11:04, and we do want to keep these meetings to about an hour and a half. So if anyone else has any comments, questions, or concerns for Joe, please raise your hand. Sharon?
I just want to say that we could ask the city council to support the public bank. That would be a short-term action we could do.
Okay, thank you for that comment, Ms. Thomas. Anyone else have any comments as well on the presentation that we just had? As I'm seeing none, Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. If you can actually, I know that you said that you had a link to a couple things that you wanted to get to us. If you could email that to our staff or to me, and we can distribute that to the group, I'd be very appreciative of that. And you probably will get a phone call or an email from me as well, just on the community foundation side, because I think that's some really exciting things that we can help with. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll share with Francisco. Thanks, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. Good luck.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Okay, with that being said, we just went over the inclusive economic recovery framework through Joe and the Brookings Institute, which was really great. So I think we have an opportunity to start thinking about action items, like Debbie said, maybe something that is more here and now and not 24 to 48 months out. But I do think those are going to be important later on down the line. So I think we should definitely be looking at right now first, but also thinking creatively about what we can do in the far future with that in relation to that. With that being said, let's go ahead and start moving on to the next part of the agenda, which is workforce scholarship for retooling and retraining. I know that we kind of brought that up at the last meeting, and I know there was some concerns and questions legally if this was something that we could look into. So let's go ahead and start this discussion, this conversation, and see where we're at on this and see if this is something we can do.
Hello, everybody. I just want to let you know that I have been working with different groups in the community to try and get more and more information, especially some of that stuff that we kind of talked about last time that you were wanting more information on. Believe it or not, it's been challenging. Like we're learning every day that there's different points of metrics that we want to look at that we really weren't looking at before. And so it's not been super simple sometimes to be like, well, what happened with this demographic? Well, what happened with these people? Well, what about this specific for one specific county? You know, we may know statewide what it looks like, but do we know down to the micro level what happened? And so those are the things that I'm working back and forth with the state to get information on. So I just want to let you guys know that this is a work in progress. I'm trying to pull as much information together as possible for you. So I'm going to share with you what I have so far. I need to get screen sharing, please.
Cindy, can you help us with that?
Dominic.
Oh, I think I got it. Let's see. Here we go. Wonderful. Okay, so one of the I think most important elements of proposing this scholarship as it looks from the perspective of the workforce system currently, I think is supporting the alternative licensure and LEAP type programs. So basically last year we went full throttle with the alternative licensure programs. And, you know, we've been working together with a LEAP program. And, you know, we're working with, we were starting with Las Cruces public schools, and then we kind of started working our way out in other areas of the Southwest. But ultimately what we ended up finding is that, of course, because it was a pilot, we ran into some trouble. And I think that either way, we would have continued to work it out, you know, and get to the point where we could serve more and more people. But the challenge is that we, for the first time ever, expended all $3 million of our training dollars. And that's never happened before in our region. And so what we do know is there's a need, and we know we've identified it. What we need to do now is, you know, work towards making sure we can get that to more people. Of course, our board, you know, approved more dollars to be transferred over into the program and allowed for us to continue serving people. However, you know, there are people who don't fit in the box for one reason or another, because as wonderful and well-intended as the federal programs are, they do have red tape on them, and they do have limitations, and it makes it challenging to be able to serve any person who walks through the door, because every single situation is so unique. And so some of the challenges is the funding stream firewalls. We can't double dip, and ultimately what happens is that an individual, they go to a school, or let's say they're already working with the school, but they need to step up their licensing, and they want to move into another area of focus or whatever it may be. And so basically they get that agreement with the schools, and then the school and them work together with the higher education, and then higher education works with us. And then we work, you know, with the individual to get them eligible for the tuition assistance. So ultimately they already have their position somewhat secured by the time they come to us, and that's the way it works. So ultimately the teacher knows where they want to work, or they are already working where they want to work when they come to us. And so if that school happens to have the same type of funding that we have, but it, you know, of course it's being utilized for some other purpose, we can't fund it because that's considered double dipping. And so that's one scenario where one may not be able to get assistance from us. And then the second one is the federal eligibility requirements. They're vast, and I think for the most part, a large portion of the population does fit into that criteria. But there are still plenty that don't. There's income limits. So of course, if you're dependent and the head of your household and the only source of income makes fairly good money, you may not be able to do that. But that to us, is something that we don't want to limit people and what they can do as an individual person because of someone else in their household, because that's not their income, that's not their career. And that's, so, we would love to be able to say, what does it matter? This person is looking to move themselves up and have self-sustainability. Why not be able to do that? But of course there's limitations there. And then of course, we're looking for individuals with different types of barriers, that of course their low income is always one, different types of disabilities, being a part of one of the native nations, there's different a laundry list of different ones that we can look at in order to find one eligible. But believe it or not, we run into people who just don't fall into any of those categories. And even though for the most part, it is really, it's really likely that we can finesse it and really, really look closely and dig deep and find a solution that's within the federal guidelines to get them approved. We just got to do our homework. The trouble comes up when we are like we were last year, where we are running out of funding and we have to start scrutinizing a little bit more, because the focus is always helping those individuals with the most barriers. So if you have two people walk through the door and one of them has a disability, is low income, and they fall under multiple categories, and the other one is at the high end of the spectrum of income, and they have no other disability, they have no other barriers. Of course, when we're in a point where we're low on funding, we need to choose the individual that has the most barriers, because that's the point, that's the intention of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. And so, it's not that it's not possible to sometimes make people eligible, it's that we're in a pickle. We want to make those dollars go farther, and we want to make sure that we're serving the ones most in need. We do have to start raising the bar a little bit. And, that's just the unfortunate side effect of being successful and running these programs, is that if you're successful and you're expending all that money and you're getting people training and you're doing a great job, then you start having to tell people no. You start having to turn people away because you run out of money. And that's the stinky side effect of doing a really, really knock-up job. So I think, the last thing is going to be the program restrictions, and that's mostly speaking to the people who are going into for college or higher education or technical training, because as it stands, we have to go according to what we call in-demand fields. And there's a little more information about this down at the bottom, but if they're in demand, we go through a series of, litmus tests, I guess, of determining whether or not a field is in demand. And so we're looking at ONET, we're looking at, the labor market information, we're looking at the potential growth for that field, we're making sure there's actually jobs for that individual in our region. And the hard part about that is that sometimes the state of New Mexico may be considered as a whole a good industry for a certain sector. But then if you look, if you zoom in to the local area that the individual is at, it's not. So maybe in Santa Fe, something's considered a sustainable job with growth, but it may not be in Las Cruces or Socorro. And we have to go based on the local area the individual is in. And so that's where it can become an issue as well. Although we know that these issues exist, coming up with the specific data is something that I'm having to work collaboratively with LCPS, our workforce board, the talent collaborative, and of course, higher education. And that's what I'm doing right now. So we have a conversation going on right now between several of us, you know, with Wendy, Dr. Wendy, and you know, different people from these different organizations that are key players in this process for these programs, and trying to get some more actual data. Because if an individual comes to us and says, oh, hey, I want to work at this school. Oh, well, we already know that school has Title I dollars and we can't fund it there. That person doesn't get logged anywhere. So we don't currently have a system to log, okay, this many people didn't get funding. These many people didn't get to join the program. We don't have that. And now I'm thinking maybe that's a process I need to develop so that we are tracking that, because now we know this is valuable information. But that's not something we have. So I'm working with the school so that I can try to get you guys some actual data on how many people, you know, the school sent to us and came back and said they couldn't help me. And I'm hoping that we can get some more information to help you guys understand. That's just one piece of the demographic, though. I mean, we're talking about one group. It's a large group. I'll tell you that right now. It's a large group. Helping and filling the gap for the alternative licensure programs is going to be a huge chunk of who this proposed scholarship would help, because we have a huge demand, and we know that that's kind of what tipped us over last year with our funding, is that we launched that program and it kind of just went over the top. So as that information comes available, I will be sharing that with you guys from the schools. So the sector strategies can limit dollars. So don't get me wrong, the sector strategies is something that has been proven to be extremely effective in creating career pathways and developing really efficient and effective ways to spend those tax dollars and get a community self-sustaining. We know that, and it's definitely something that we need to do. The scattered spending is not as effective in the grander scheme of things as this more focused, intentional process. However, though, it does still limit the dollars, because if the dollars have to follow the fields or the sectors, then what happens when somebody wants to go to school for something that doesn't fall under one of those categories? What happens for entrepreneurs? We know that entrepreneurs, sometimes they're not in a field that's considered having sustainable growth. It may be something relatively new. It may be something that we need, but we just don't have. So if we're going based off the traditional pattern that we use to determine if somebody can get funding, there's a high likelihood that someone who is trying to start their own business is probably not going to fall under this category. We will not find it a sustainable field. So, I mean, not a sustainable, it will not be an in-demand field. And so we kind of almost completely cut those folks out, which is really something I feel like is unfortunate, because I think that some of the most passionate business owners that we have in our community, and what makes our community so rich and culturally rich, are those entrepreneurs. So that's kind of where it can get a little bit difficult, is when we're looking specifically at certain fields and certain sectors, and we say this is where we want to throw all of our energy, and we want to focus on these first. It doesn't necessarily say we can't help somebody that's outside of that, but it does take a little extra work and policy movement sometimes to be able to do that. Like, for example, the local workforce board just recently approved film. So now we have the ability to use dollars for film, because it's now an industry in demand. So it's possible, but it's not like we can just do it. And sometimes what happens is the individual kind of has a window and the window goes. And by the time we get the system to catch up to what they need, the window's gone for them. And so if we're looking at this from the individual standpoint, it would be extremely beneficial for them to have another bucket of funding that they could turn to if we weren't able to to help them right then and there, especially in those circumstances where they kind of had a really good opportunity and didn't have the ability to, wait 4 months for the system to catch up. So this is just some other information that some of the folks on this call had asked about last week. Once again, it's been a challenge getting this type of information on a local level. It's definitely coming into our system, but is there a report? Where is the report? Who knows how to get the report? All of that stuff has been the sticky point. So basically all this information is like me just bothering different people until I got it. So we're working on that. I've been working with our state, the Department of Workforce Solutions, to help us get better familiar with what the capabilities of our system is so that we know how to pull this valuable data that helps us make decisions about new policies and programs. But what I do have is, as I spoke to you guys last week, or I think it was the week before when I did the presentation initially about workforce, All Hands New Mexico is the website that the Cabinet Secretary, Department of Workforce Solutions, developed for employers to be able to just jump on there, fill out a simple form, and begin the process of starting a job posting within our system. And then in addition to that, we have what we call rapid response. And so the Department of Workforce Solutions has to respond when there's a closure, when there's a facility that maybe they shut down and they moved something, they could have moved it overseas, or maybe it just completely shut down. And the point of that obviously is to track that data and that information and to track trends there, but it's also to determine if in fact it was a massive enough layoff and we know that those jobs were sent overseas, we have the ability to get the TAA dollars for each of those individuals to be able to get unemployment for 2 years while they're getting a degree. So we are able to give them tuition or technical training dollars, as well as extend their unemployment so that they can get a degree and or a technical certificate so that they can actually bring themselves above where they were at with the job they were in that got dissolved. So that's what the rapid response does. And so last week, they received notices from Sunland Park Racetrack and Casino. There are 259 individuals that have been furloughed. The employer did not wish for us to engage with them so that, because normally what the rapid response does, and I've done rapid responses before, is that we actually go on site. And so the employer will schedule times for us, maybe 3 or 4 times throughout the day, and bring in different groups, 50 at a time, whatever it may be. Right now we're doing them virtually on Zoom. And basically we have different segments. One segment goes through unemployment insurance, how to apply, what to expect. And then, what I have done or somebody in my shoes has done is they come in and they give all the breakdown of what the workforce has to offer, training opportunities, etc. So ultimately, that is what the racetrack did not want. They did not want us to come in and do a Zoom with their staff to inform them of what is going on. So they just sent us a letter notifying us and notifying the employees of what was going to happen. And so we will have to just work on, as those individuals start to apply for unemployment, contacting them individually. HR Peabody Mine in Grants, New Mexico, 50 employees being laid off. Of course, there's barriers in areas like that with Wi-Fi, so it makes it difficult for us to do this. So they're going to have to do it by call to talk with the unemployment, talk about the unemployment benefits with those individuals. Navajo Nation Gaming, I actually don't know exactly where that's at. There was 1,081 laid off. Chino Mines laid off 825. Those have been approved for those TAA training dollars. So hopefully we'll be able to support them. And then our All Hands New Mexico team will be continuously following up with those employers and the employees to make sure that they have everything that they need from us. May 31st, Empyrean Marketing they closed, and 128 employees at that time were laid off. This is a permanent closing. Those jobs will not be coming back. On January of this year is actually before the pandemic. 389 folks were laid off with Concentrics. And those individuals, we believe those jobs were sent off overseas and they were eligible for the TAA dollars. And then Kmart laid off 100 to 200 people. And so we know that those are permanent closures as well. So this is kind of the scattered information that I get at this point. So I'm working on trying to really get some isolated reports so that we can focus on each of the counties that we're overseeing in this region. But ultimately, we know that we are seeing lots of furloughs turn into permanent closures. And that's one thing I'm trying to get a report on as we speak, because there was a lot of them that started off as a furlough in March, and then they rolled over into a closure, unfortunately, when they weren't able to reopen when they thought they would. We have 181 companies that have reached out to us, and just last week, 236 job orders were put in. There's 1,315 job openings, and 617 have been referred. We've referred individuals to those jobs. So we are working with the Department of Workforce Solutions to figure out how we can work together with the local, the community colleges and the different organizations to try and get this sustainable work at the focus point. We had a whole bunch of other plans before COVID, but now we realize that we have to focus our dollars on sustainable work, meaning work that will be around whether we have a global pandemic or, natural disaster, whatever it may be. And so we're trying to work together to figure out what are those jobs? What is it that we want to invest extra in, even if it's not traditionally the highest paying jobs in the world? It's a job and it's sustainable and it'll help carry people through economic crisis. So the last thing is, how much does workforce spend on each participant on average? And so for tuition, not including the credentialing test, per term, we're spending on average $1,155.87. So it just depends on, of course, what kind of credential this person is going after, and of course how costly it is. Different credentials or have different costs associated with them. We also cover supportive services, which is childcare, transportation, medical needs. It's a pretty long list of things that we can help people with. And the point of that is, if they're in training, if they're if they are in the process of on the job training, so they're working, but they're still in one of our programs, if they're trying to get their high school equivalency, any of those things, we want to make sure they're successful. We want to make sure that nothing stops them, because traditionally the thing that stops people from completing their credentials are just unexpected life experience, basically. And that's, I'm having a human experience right now. I'm home right now with 3 kids, and it's challenging, and we're trying to work, and they're going to start school soon, and here's all these challenges. There's challenges with childcare, there's challenges with anything. What happens if you let's say a parent was there was a 2-parent family and both of them were working in order to pay the rent. Now one lost their job. That changes the dynamic. Suddenly the other one may need to pull extra shifts, and can you still go to school, work 2 shifts, take care of a family? Probably not. So you're more likely to just go ahead and quit school. And so ultimately the goal is, okay, do you need childcare? Sure. Do you need help paying your rent? Are you late on your rent? We'll pay for that. Well, we're doing whatever we can do to make sure that there's as least amount of reasons to give up before completion as possible. And so what we think that we have, for on-the-job training is $11,000 per contract, which means it's about the 6-month period, because we reimburse the employer up to 75% of the employee's wages for up to 6 months while they're training. Now, the on-the-job training doesn't have as many limitations. It just can't be entry level. That's the limitation. It has to be something that's kind of a step up, at least from the entry level. So it has to be sustainable. We also have a limit where the minimum they can make is $14.62 an hour. So of course, for a smaller employer that, really could use this program, but can't afford to pay that kind of money, probably can't participate in this program. We have the ability to get waivers, but we can only do so many of them in each area. And we usually tap out of that real soon in the PY. So that would be one area where these scholarships also might be able to be utilized, is that if an employer is hiring, but they can only pay $11 an hour, you may be able to support that through a scholarship and do a similar thing to the on-the-job training program to essentially help get someone into a new job and help an employer get themselves back on their feet. So it's kind of a two-edged sword. So ultimately, I'm still working right now to find out what we need, what our supportive services is, because I know that's something that the city will probably want to know, like, well, how much money in addition to that, $1,200 or $1,100 are you guys paying to make sure they're successful? The other thing I'm working with the board on is to see if we would still be able to do supportive services even though we weren't paying for the tuition or weren't paying for the on-the-job training. So let's say it's an individual who comes to us, they don't qualify because XYZ reason. So then we refer them to the City of Las Cruces scholarship. They get funded through there, but technically they're still enrolled in a program. So can we still do supportive services? So they can still come back to us if they need childcare. So that's something else that I'm trying to work with the board to determine. But this is gonna, be a developing story here in the next couple of weeks. Does anybody have any questions so far?
Nothing yet, but I will remind you that it is 11:30 and we probably need to start wrapping the meeting up here pretty shortly.
I'm good. That was my last page. So I will let you guys know as I get more of that data, and I will try to work with, we'll probably be working with Griselda and Francisco to really form a good proposal, a tangible proposal for how this could be rolled out.
Perfect. And then did we ever get the legal question asked of whether this violates the what is it called? The anti-donation clause that New Mexico has? Do we have the answer to that yet, Ms. Martinez or Francisco?
Mr. Chair, this is Griselda Martinez for the record. We are still pending to have more information on what the
No, Mr. Chair, can you hear Griselda, or was she lost? I know she was having internet connection problems, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Okay. The only thing that I wanted to mention is that once we have the full proposal, at that point we can take it to our legal department for review. But we will have to have the full proposal on in order to know exactly what it entails, and then from there being able to move forward with it. So with that legal question, it's I guess the answer to that is still standing by pending the proposal, the full proposal. And I think you're muted, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I think you're muted.
That was my only real question through this. I think that it's a great idea to get those dollars into people's hands to help further training. So Mrs. Lopez, I really do thank you for this presentation. It was very thoughtful, very well organized, and I think it answered a lot of my questions that I had the last time. Mr. Harris, I see that do you have your hand raised, sir?
Yes, Michael Harris for the record. Yeah, that was a very thorough presentation. I guess the thing that caught my eye is that you mentioned that there were 1,315 job openings currently. And it seems like if there's people posting jobs right now, that those are pretty interesting to focus on. So I was curious, A, if you knew what those were real quick. But if not, going forward, I think that's a very interesting number for us to look at, short term, because that's where the jobs are.
Yeah, I can definitely I have that report on what employers by industry and then by the actual name, amount of positions and things like that. So I can get that.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Lopez? As I am seeing none, I would recommend that this be do you think, Ms. Lopez, that we're gonna have any real actionable items for next week, or do we need to put this off maybe until the following week?
Griselda, are you back on?
She is, there she is.
I'm sorry, my computer just disconnected, so I had to switch to my phone. Mr. Chair, I believe that we would need, as I was saying, talking to myself, we would need to have a proposal that we can run through our legal department and have their legal opinion. So I would recommend, if possible, for this to be an actionable item in a couple of weeks rather than next Thursday.
Wonderful. Okay, so we will push this off until we have a better proposal ready to go. So we will take this off the agenda for next week's discussion. With that being said, is there any other questions for Ms. Lopez, or are we pretty much good to move on with this? As seeing none, we're going to go ahead and move on to future discussion items. If there are any discussion items that anyone has in mind that maybe we need to look into or consider. We had this great presentation from the Brookings Institute once again. That was awesome. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for really suggesting that. I learned a whole lot today. And then we also had the presentation by Ms. Lopez, furthering the discussion on the scholarship that we could possibly bring to the table with the city of Las Cruces. Does anyone else have any possible discussion items that we can do? Michael Harris, you had your hand up first, sir.
Sure, Michael Harris for the record. So I have 3 things that I noted that we could possibly bring up to the city in the short term. It sounds like increased PPE availability, like, making it available at low or no cost to local businesses, would be an interesting thing that the city could do. Something like the Birmingham Service Corps model also seems like a very interesting short-term item. And maybe even, Workforce Connections could help cross-fund that in some way with their training dollars. And then another action item that we could bring up to the city, I think that Ms. Sharon Thomas brought up, was that we could suggest that they have a resolution or something in support of the state public bank. And that's all.
Okay, so we have several ideas. As a public bank goes, I don't even think there's been a bill yet to suggest to the legislature. Correct me if I'm wrong. I have not seen anything. So I don't know if we can necessarily suggest to the city council that they support something when they don't know what they're supporting, because there is not a bill yet. But besides that, I think those other ideas are really good. I see 2 other hands raised. Miss Sharon Thomas.
Yes, there has already been a presentation to the council about the public bank, and they were in support. And the public bank people are, I have the document right now that's for the legislation. And so they're going to be going forward with bringing a summary of that to various councils and commissions around the state. And so I don't think we're quite ready to bring that to the council, but I can get a timeline for you. And if people in this group want a presentation so they understand it better, we can probably do that. But they're close to putting together the legislation, and they will be, and they're working on garnering support from all over the state at this point.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, Mr. Miller.
I think most everybody covered my ideas. I think also that just the PPE, it could be more than that the businesses need. So we need to probably find out what they urgently need to open up that's causing them extra expenses because of COVID. So maybe he mentioned things like grants or technical assistance and PPE, but so could expand that a little bit. Service Corps thing, I think that was right. The only thing about the public bank, we can still influence it if we need to. I don't know if it was we want to discuss further about the community buy-in, I guess, or ownership of parts of that, whether we want to try to recommend anything like that. But that's just open for discussion. That's the only things I have.
Okay, thank you for that. So we have a couple recommendations as far as discussion items go. As far as the PPE supplies go to businesses, I know that the state has a program. I don't know if there's any way that we can piggyback off of that, and or what we can really do or say, but I definitely think there should be a citywide initiative with that. Miss Debbie Moore, you do have your hand raised, and
Yes.
You're probably
Debbie Moore, Bird Loss Christmas Chamber. We being the chamber are still giving away masks. We still have a supply at the office, and certainly I was just on a call this morning where there's some opportunity for us to get more involved in the PPE process, i.e. sanitizers, gloves, things of that nature. So there are some initiatives already being done. Mr. Chair, I do have a question. Maybe you or Sharon could answer it. I too have had a presentation of the public bank concept. And I guess my question would be, and make sure I'll be able to answer it. Do they have a direct tie to recovery with regards to COVID in their legislation or potential legislation?
As I have not read the legislation, I am not the proper person to speak to that. Does anyone know? I have no idea. Ms. Sharon Thomas.
Yeah, I can check. I haven't looked at the entire document I have right now, but I think part of their argument will be that especially in these kinds of crisis times, a public bank could provide enormous support to local businesses. So I can just give a short report on that next time if you want. I'm about to finish reading the proposed legislation, and I can get in touch with the people who are doing this and see what their timeline is.
Okay. That would be great. Maybe if we can not do it as a discussion item and just email it to the board for a future discussion item to see where we're at on that. Because I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that being a discussion topic. I don't know if it's time to do that. And Mr. Harris.
Michael Harris for the record. Yeah, as somebody who's also very interested in that, I think it would be useful to have it emailed. We could read it over and maybe discuss it in a couple weeks.
Yeah. So if you guys can email that to Francisco, Sharon, he will distribute it to the board, and the board can review for the following meeting for a discussion item in 2 weeks. I think that would probably be the best option for us.
Okay.
And then we say that again, Sharon. I'm sorry.
No, I just said, okay, I can do that. They're working on a real short description that I can send around.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, and so Mr. Harris, you did say something. What was your wording on your discussion topic that you said earlier?
Let's see. I had the PPE one. The local service corps was the second.
Okay, and what do you think this board can do with the local service corps? What would be your actionable item with this?
I think my actionable item would be just, suggest that the city expand its. We already have done some programs that I think fit some of the pieces of it. And so maybe the discussion item would be, look at the programs that the city's done so far. I know they've sent funds to FYI to do lunches and things like that. And maybe has some support for testing sites. But we could look at the programs that the city's already done and then look at maybe what the differences are between that and what, say, Birmingham has done. That seems like a very specific example that was in the presentation. And then prepare a list of, here's the gaps, and present that to the city and say, here's what we suggest to help address these gaps. And we should expand these programs and maybe add these others.
Okay, so what you're asking then is for a presentation by the city of current programs we have going on. Is that correct?
Yes, and specifically towards the things that maybe directly employ people by the city or use city employees who are furloughed or provide funds to organizations, to service organizations and directly employ people. I think we've had a pretty good presentation discussion of technical business assistance programs. So I think we're probably covered there. We don't need to rehash that. So yeah, that's what I think we should hear.
Okay. So let's go ahead and then get that on the agenda for the next meeting. Ms. Martinez, you do have your hand raised.
Hi, this is Jolene Martinez for the record. Thank you, Michael, for recommending the service corps. We do have some similarly situated service corps here in Las Cruces already. So at FYI, we run an AmeriCorps VISTA program. And then there's also the MRSCs, the Medical Reserve Corps. They're actually actively working right now with some stand-up sites serving the medical personnel that have tested positive for COVID. And they're actually being isolated in these isolation stations being supported by the county. And so we have a big number of Medical Reserve Corps individuals here volunteering and working. And there's a lot of medical staff, teachers, retired personnel that are part of the Doniana Communities United. And so there's a lot of different service corps organizations that already exist in Doniana. I think maybe the city could play a role in how we bring them together for employment strategies of unemployed individuals. And to me, a big portion of that was identifying not just who are those that are unemployed, but who are the ones that are most at risk and already existed in that 54% wage equity gap, and making sure that we're reaching out to those individuals for employment first and prioritizing that gap. But I would agree that I think a service corps is something that maybe the city could respond rather timely to employing a small number of individuals for a very targeted response. during COVID, and then help support those individuals back to their natural job environments where they were prior to COVID. So I think that's a good topic for us to continue.
Wonderful. I like those. Okay, so discussion item. We have two. One is going to be an increased effort on distributing PPE gear. A discussion of what we can do or what we can recommend with that. I know that the county has done a lot of work with that. There's been a lot of social media pushes of people out in front of the county building distributing. So that will be one good topic that we can talk about, and it's something that can probably be done pretty quickly. Another one is going to be in line with what we've just been talking about and the community action, kind of like the Las Cruces Strong initiative that we've had going on for years, kind of doing something like that almost is what it sounds like. So I think those are two great discussion items. And then we can go forth with the scholarship initiative and any other future conversations on that on a following week. With that being said, I think those are two very good and very strong conversations to have. So that kind of concludes our future discussion items for the next couple weeks. It sounds like we do have quite a few things to consider. With that being said, let's go ahead and go into any discussions. Does any announcements or anything going on? If anyone has anything to announce with an organization or a nonprofit that you're with, or something that might be related to a meeting that one of us can join in on to kind of get more information, please let us know. Raise your hand and let's hear that announcement. Okay, seeing none, I will, Griselda, yes, ma'am.
Chair, this is Griselda Martinez for the record. I want to let you know that tomorrow there is a Zoom meeting organized by the Greater Chamber, and this is to talk about availability of PPP, that it's going to be ending on August the 8th. So for any business that it still hasn't been served by this opportunity, this is almost like the last opportunity for the upcoming week for them to connect to a service provider. So if you can let others know, that would be great. And Debbie has sent an invite with the information to log into the webinar. So that's a time sensitive item that would be very helpful for businesses. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Perfect. I think that is a great announcement. Anyone else have anything that they want to announce or talk about? As I see none, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, this is Francisco Payeras for the record. The only thing that I wanted to mention is that it's a motion to adjourn and a second as well. We need a second in there. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
I can second now, can't I? This is Darlene Lopez for the record.
Yes, you can.
All right, I second.
Thank you. So we have a motion and a second to adjourn. I would call this meeting adjourned. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and have a great week, and we will see you next time, okay?